Morning. It's a beautiful morning on Wednesday. I recently have been spending some time digging through some old podcasts that I had spent a lot of time during lockdowns and quarantine and whatever listening to, and I've circled back to a lot of those, and I've listened to a handful of them again and again and again and again. And there's one that I really do enjoy. It's got a lot of insightful information in it. I'll give you the brief highlights, and then I'll sort of get to the reflections and the things that I really want to talk about. This particular podcast is a recording from an event called Socrates in the City, which is hosted, founded, organized by Eric Metaxas, where he brings speakers in to do these events. And they talk about, typically it's connected to a book that they're writing, but they talk about a topic that they have an expertise in, and it revolves around life and God and some of the really serious and strenuous questions we have about life and faith, about faith and science. And so people like Sir John Polkinghorne and N.T. Wright and Os Guinness and a handful of other really, really smart individuals who typically are people of faith and can answer a lot of these questions. And some of them are cool and related directly to the biblical text and how the biblical text overlaps with science. Like Dr. Colin Nichol talking about the Star of Bethlehem as a comet, and the research that he did to talk about the alignment of the stars and the constellations and the biblical depictions of what is happening with the Star of Bethlehem, with the movement that would be typical of a comet, and so being able to sort of pin down, maybe the Star of Bethlehem was actually a comet. It behaves this way. We see it described that way in the scripture. So some of it's like that, and then there are some things that are Eric Metaxas does a sort of, this is what I learned by doing the Dietrich Bonhoeffer biography that he wrote, or he has Dr. Michael Ward come in and do, hey, this is a thing that makes sense out of the sort of hidden element to C.S. Lewis in the Chronicles of Narnia. And this is really what I want to pick up on today. So Dr. Ward is talking through Lewis's theming and how he presents the God and the theological elements in the Chronicles of Narnia. And so he starts working through each of the Narnia stories in super brief but big picture looks. Spends a lot of time on The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And one of the things that he talks about is the reality that C.S. Lewis was a literature professor who was ultimately primarily concerned in his writing as a professional and as a professor in the medieval mythologies and how those medieval mythologies made sense out of the medieval world. And so the seven heavens of the medieval world, Jupiter and Saturn and the moon and the sun, and talking about the planets as these stages to the heavens, but the divine characteristics of the ancient gods as perspective, and Lewis's ability to take those characteristics of mythological characters like Jupiter and weave them in to his depictions and theology of what's going on with God in the Narnia stories. And so the kingly Jupiter is reflected in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And it's a story all about kingship, Aslan's kingship, and Peter's kingship, and Edmund's, and it goes on from there. So there's this intertwined and there's this hidden element to what's going on in the Narnia stories. Well, as Dr. Ward makes his argument and as he talks about what's going on in Lewis's hidden element and theming in the Narnia Chronicles, he goes back and he says, Lewis wrote a piece called Reflections in a Toolshed. And Lewis describes being in his tool shed at home and seeing the light come in through a space, a crack in the shed, and cast light on the floor. And standing in the darker parts of the shed could look and see what the light illuminated in the shed. And so Lewis then turns this analogy into an analogy of sort of the scripture. But it works like this. We can stand and look at what is illuminated in the world around us. The light cast upon the world around us or the object in front of us. And we can see clearly because of the light that's cast on that thing. But then Lewis describes in this reflection, he writes that he stepped into that beam of light coming through the crack in the shed, and not seeing what the light was cast on now, but seeing in the beam of light itself. And Lewis turns this reflection to talk about the scripture and to talk about his faith, to talk about God. And it basically becomes this, that there is information illuminated by the light cast from the scripture and theology. We can shine that as the psalm expresses, right? Your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. That it shines upon what is in front of us. And we can see clearly what that is because the scripture illuminates that for us. But then there is a standing in the ray of light, as it were, and not seeing only what the light is being cast upon, but now seeing through the light itself. And that there is a way to understand the world by shining light on what it is we want to look at. And I think by and large, we do this a lot. We ask questions as Christians that is effectively, what does Scripture say about this? And then we try and take the light from Scripture and shine it upon the light from our theology and from our faith and from our theological tradition and shine it upon a particular issue. So what does Scripture or God or our Christian belief, faith, and theology say about oppression or about racism or about how we treat people in a fair and equitable and a just way? And then we ask questions. Okay, so if our faith says X, then now I do this, and that's taking the light and shining it upon something and saying, okay, so do I now see this clearly by the light I can cast upon it? But then there's another level, there's another layer, there's another way. And the other way is not just can I cast the light of Scripture upon this and thereby see it more clearly, see it differently, see it in a nuanced kind of way, but can I step into the light of Scripture and see by that light, see in that light, be immersed in it so much that it's not, let me take this and shine it like a flashlight on this world around me, but see in an integrated way Scripture's world and worldview, such that I don't see only that which I cast a light on, but I see through the ray of light that is the Scripture. And I think that there's a dramatic difference here. Seeing the light of Scripture cast upon something is good. And we need that, and we need to ask that question. And I spend a lot of my time asking questions of, is there a way from the Scripture to shine this light on this thing and get answers to what do I do and how do I do it and why does it matter? But then there is a way to say, I don't see upon by casting a light on this, but I see through the perspective, the ray of light that is the Scripture, that is good, proper Christian theology, that is embedded and ingrained such that it is so integral and core to worldview that I see and experience and encounter the world around me through the lens, through the ray of light that is the truth of Scripture, of our faith and theology, of our tradition. And here's the question that I'm asking myself. Do I consistently default to a shine the light upon, which again isn't necessarily bad, but I think there's another way to look at the world. Do I consistently default to let me just shine the light of my Christian faith on this topic? Or am I allowing the scripture, our rich theological and Christian tradition, to be so infused and ingrained and core to me that I not only can shine the light of my theology, tradition, and scripture on a topic, but I can see the world through the lens, through the ray of light that is the truth. And I encounter it in this internal and this penetrating way. Penetrating is probably the best word for it. This penetrating way that is so saturated in the way the truth of Scripture and of our theology and tradition sits, that everything around me is experienced in this ray of light. That, I think, is incredibly challenging. That, I think, is incredibly valuable. And I think it does something for us. There is a way to go about our Christian faith, which is, let me ask something Scripture says about X and just cast that light upon the topic, the idea, the person, the whatever, and then go about conducting based on what the light does upon this entity. But then there's a way to go about our Christian life and faith that's infused, that's saturated, that stands in the ray of light and sees along it instead of sees by it, that integrates this scriptural, theological worldview with the life I lead. And there's a place for both of these. Let me shine the light of Scripture upon this thing, and let me see along within this ray of light, in accordance with, in saturation with. And I'm coming to a place where I think more and more consistently, the only way we will accurately do the let me shine the light of Scripture upon is by first saying, let me see along. Let me see with, let me see in, let me see saturated by the perspectives of Scripture. That movement first, to be richly saturated and infused with the worldview and the perspective of the Scripture, helps and guides my let me shine the light of Scripture upon to such an extent that not only do I have a rich and abiding, a deep, saturated worldview, but that worldview is so informed and saturated that when I cast the light of Scripture or the light of our theological tradition and truth upon, I do so faithfully to the full breadth and depth of the Scripture's tradition. It becomes less topical and it becomes more infused. It becomes more I don't want to say intuitive because it sounds too nebulous or touchy-feely to me. But really, I think that's what it is. That there is this level of I know this worldview, this perspective, this lens on the world to be truly insightful and accurate. And so then as I engage it and shine the light of truth and Scripture upon the situations and circumstances of my world, this seeing along the truth now provides me with a way to apply that truth to given situations that is in concert with a full spectrum, with a deep and abiding theological outlook. And that, I hope, is my growing tendency as I look at the world around me. Is there a scriptural tradition by which I can see along and see by it the world around me. That looking through it, the world and the truth makes sense. And then thereby, in that internal reality first, apply that to the external circumstances and life situations. And that requires us to spend the time with our scripture and with our tradition, not looking for how do I apply this, but what do I do with this as a thing that sits and reorients and reshapes and alters the way that I look at the world around me. And so that in some sense is what I've been endeavoring as we talk through this stuff in 1st and 2nd Peter. But that's my prayer as we continue forward, that we would see along and then thereby see by. And so as you encounter the scripture in your own time, places and spaces, as we read and endeavor to be informed, infused with these perspectives that are rich and deep and abiding, I pray that you would not only be able to say, what does the scripture tell me about and how do I apply it? But how do I see along this light and in the tradition of this truth in order to consistently and constantly orient the world around me to this perspective? Have a good day.